At the end of October 2020, Apple dipped by more than 5% in a single day. Within the next week, however, it had more than recovered its original price. If you had bought that dip, you would have gained more than 5% within the week, handily beating the S&P's yearly return. This begs the question, should you buy the dip? How consistent is this behavior and how often can you count on a recovery? Let's find out. One way of deciding if you should buy a dip is by looking at how long it usually takes to recover from that dip. Let's look at how long it usually takes Apple to recover after it has dipped 5 to 10% in a single day. This chart plots the proportion of cases against the number of days it takes to recover. For example, if we look at cases that took a month to recover, we can see that this makes up 60% of the cases. That is, in 60% of the cases where Apple dipped by 5 to 10% in a single day, there was a recovery within a month. If you are able to wait for 6 months, that percentage increases to more than 80%, meaning that if you had bought Apple stock after it dipped 5 to 10% within a day, you can usually count on it recovering its original value within half a year. But is this true no matter the size of the dip? Let's look at different dip sizes. Here the blue line is what we saw before with a 5 to 10% dip over the course of a day. The orange represents a 10 to 20% dip in a day, while the green and red represent more than 20% dips. Right away we can see that there is significant variation, with a larger dip perhaps unsurprisingly meaning that the stock will take longer to recover on average. We can also look at dips that happen over the course of a week. The trend here is consistent, with a larger dip meaning that Apple takes longer to recover. That raises another question of interest: does it matter how long the dip takes? For 5 to 10% dip, we see that there is not much of a difference whether that dip happened in a single day or even a single week or month. The time for recovery remains about the same on average. Looking at 10 to 20% dips, however, the trend is clearer. The longer Apple takes to dip, the longer it takes to recover, at least for larger dip sizes. Of course, this could just be an anomaly, so let's see if this is true for all stocks. Unsurprisingly, there is a huge variation across stocks in the S&P 500 when it comes to recovery time. However, we can see that most stocks still have a high chance of recovering within 8 months, or 250 days. Another way to look at it is just by pooling all the dips for all the stocks together. Here we see that when there was a 5 to 10% dip over a single day, about 88% of the time, there would be a recovery within 6 months. If the dip was larger, that percentage goes down further. For smaller dips, a larger proportion do recover within half a year. As before, we do see that the time the stock takes to dip also impacts how long it takes to recover, with a longer time generally meaning a longer recovery, as we saw with Apple. One other way of looking at whether you should buy a dip is by asking, is it more likely to dip further or to rise? Let's take a look at Apple once again and ask the question, after Apple has had a one-day dip, is it more likely to rise or to fall the following day? This chart tells us that about 40% of the time Apple will dip further the following day, after it has had a 5 to 10% dip within a single day. Equivalently, we can say that after Apple has had a 5 to 10% dip within a single day, it has a higher chance of rising rather than falling the next day. What if we were to look at a 1-week dip? Is Apple more likely to dip the next week or to rise? Here we look at price movements the week after the dip across different dip sizes. We see that for a 5 to 10% dip represented by the blue line, the odds are much more even. It's about 50-50 whether it will rise or fall. For a larger dip, such as a 10 to 20% dip, represented by the orange line, Apple would only fall the following week about 45% of the time. Now let's see if this holds true for all stocks. Here let's look at price movements of stocks in the S&P 500 the month after it had dipped 10 to 20% in the previous month. We see that for most stocks, after dipping by 10 to 20% within a month, they would see a rise in the next month more than 50% of the time. We can also take an aggregated view. Here we look at price movements the day after a dip. We're looking at the orange line, which represents a 10 to 20% dip in one day, and the green line, which represents a 20 to 50% dip in one day. We can see that about 40% of the time, the stock would fall the next day. Equivalently, we see that when a stock dipped by 10 to 50% in a single day, most of the time it rose the next day. The caveat here is that the curves will look very different based on how long the stock took to dip. So where does that leave us? Should you buy the dip? At least based on past behavior, there does seem to be a good buy signal in certain cases. But the size of that signal depends on the size of the dip, as well as how long the dip took. Thanks for watching. Click here to subscribe if you're interested to see more ideas tested in production.